Is Vasiliy Lomachenko Hall of Fame worthy? We are discussing that in the wake of his recent retirement announcement. So, with no further ado, let's go ahead and jump into it. He starts off at 126. He makes his pro debut on HBO, and immediately he gets a title shot against a grizzled veteran in Orlando Salido. Now, many people thought this was crazy. They said, yes, he was a decorated amateur. Yes, he was a two-time Olympic gold medalist, but going for a title in your second pro fight seems ridiculous, seems absurd, and honestly, Lomachenko almost pulled it off, and Orlando Salido came in overweight. He comes in overweight, he lands numerous low blows, uses every dirty trick in the book, and still, it's a split decision. So, a lot of Lomachenko critics love to point to that Salido fight. However, there was backstory and context to it, and you can literally say that Lomachenko was learning the pro game on the job, and he came on strong towards the end of that fight. If it would have gone another round or two, he may have scored a stoppage, but be that as it may, and I know Lomachenko critics will love this, he lost the fight. Fine. Here's what's big time, and even the harshest Lomachenko critic would have to agree that going straight to a shot at Gary Russell Jr., somebody who was undefeated, top in the division, a top featherweight, as your 1-1. Think about it. Lomachenko was literally 1-1 as for his professional record. If he loses against Gary Russell Jr., he is 1-2. Literally, a decorated amateur two-time Olympic gold medalist was at risk of starting his career 1-2. Now, you may argue that Lomachenko had a degree of privilege to even get a shot at Gary Russell Jr. That's debatable. If you want to make that argument, that is perfectly fine. However, we cannot argue with what Lomachenko did with that opportunity. He comes through big, puts on a clutch performance, wins a majority decision against Gary Russell Jr. to win a featherweight title in his third professional fight. Those were high stakes. A loss would have been devastating. Lomachenko comes through, and then he goes on to make, I believe it was four title defenses, if I'm not mistaken. I just jotted some quick notes. He makes four dominant title defenses at 126, and he was actually at the end of 2014, he was in the top five at 126. I'm using the Ring magazine rankings. By the end of 2015, he finishes number one, and Gary Russell finishes as number two. So even though his stay at featherweight wasn't that long, he did beat his top challenger as far as someone who was vying for the number one spot. So Loma finishes an impressive run at 126. He then debuts at 130 against a consensus top 5, maybe top 10 at worst in the division, according to Ring Magazine, Roman Martinez. Many people may not remember, but Roman Martinez was a legit junior lightweight. He was definitely an elite top guy, and Loma not only wins, but he demolishes Martinez. He wins by a fifth round KO to claim a second divisional title at 130. So already, before he even has a double digit number of fights, Lomachenko is a two division champion. Next up, and I may be skipping through some nondescript title defenses, so it's not going exactly in order, but we get to Nicholas Walters. Now, Nicholas Walters, for those who remember, he was the truth at 126 and later 130. Nicholas Walters beat Nonito Donaire, and going in, that fight was seen maybe not 50-50. I know that Lomachenko was the favorite, but Nicholas Walters was seen as a legitimate challenge. This is a guy with like 72-inch reach. He had a definite size advantage, and people were worried that Lomachenko might take a loss. But Lomachenko puts on an absolute masterclass, and he begins the No Maschenko run. What do I mean by no Maschenko? This is the beginning of a string of defenses or a string of fights at 130 where Lomachenko not only wins, but he forces his opponents to quit on the stool. Like not even knocked out, just outclassed to the point where his opponents just throw in the towel. Maybe not literally, but you get the point. Walters was one of the top featherweights, junior lightweights. Loma outclasses him. Loma then beats a top 10 contender in Jason Sosa. And then there's the ultimate showdown with Guillermo Rigondeaux. Yes, I know that Rigondeaux moved up 2 weight classes. However, this is the first ever matchup between two Olympic gold medalists who were two-time Olympic gold medalists. And Lomachenko, if nothing else, even if you're the harshest Lomachenko critic, Loma does what he's supposed to do against a smaller fighter. And Rigondeaux was no slouch. Rigondeaux was no slouch whatsoever, and Loma not only wins but forces him to retire on his stool. So that concludes a super impressive run at 130. I would say that this is where the bulk of Loma's achievements lie, and this is where he peaked. You can say that time period, 2016 2017, was peak Lomachenko, where he was operating at his absolute highest level. So, probably the end of his peak would have been his matchup with Jorge Linares. It turns out that he was battling through shoulder injuries. That fight was actually taxing. Loma got dropped. However, he got off the canvas to score a stoppage win against Jorge Linares to win the Ring Magazine lightweight championship, if I'm not mistaken. So he becomes a 3 division champion. I don't have box rec right here in front of me, so feel free to correct me if I'm wrong in the comments. But that makes him a 3 division champion. However, at this point, you can see that Loma's at a size disadvantage, and he's simply overcoming that with superior footwork, angles, skills, or what have you. He then wins a belt. I think it was the WBC belt or maybe WBO, I'm not sure. But he wins against Jose Pedraza. Now, please don't be mistaken by Pedraza's current level, because at this time in 2018, Pedraza was definitely a threat, and he turned out to be a 3 division champion. So that's a legit win at 135, given the fact that Pedraza went on to win a title at 140. This is also around the time where Pedraza fought Tank Davis a little bit after, so he definitely still had plenty in the tank. That's an impressive win. After that, Lomachenko beats Anthony Crawler. That was a solid title defense, and then he defeats Luke Campbell. Now, Luke Campbell, at worst, at this particular time, was top 5 at lightweight, and Luke Campbell was actually Ryan Garcia's first big win. So Luke Campbell, another legitimate win. He adds more to his accolades, he being Vasiliy Lomachenko, and now he's also the Ring Magazine champion at 135. So that's 2019. At that point, Lomachenko is starting to decline a bit. He's still excellent, however, no longer at his peak at 130. So ultimately, we all remember what happened in 2020. He goes up against Teofimo Lopez. It turns out he was battling through some injuries, but I'll side with the critics on this, the critics of Loma, who would say no excuses. Fine. Teofimo Lopez puts on a masterclass, and he overcomes Vasiliy Lomachenko to score the upset. No shame in that, though, because Teofimo Lopez has obviously gone on to achieve great things, so no shame in that. A smaller, older champion falls short against a young, up-and-coming champion. After that, Loma actually has a bit of a resurgence, because many people thought, well, maybe he's done, but he faces Nakatani. Nakatani actually gave Teofimo a legit challenge, and Loma goes through him. He wins by TKO in the 9th round. He then defeats, he being Loma, then defeats Richard Comey. That was a legitimate win as well, to take out 2 top 10 contenders. Now, this particular win, the next one, would be Jermaine Ortiz. Many people might argue that this was debatable. However, we've seen Jermaine Ortiz's quality since then. Ortiz actually pushed Teofimo Lopez. It was competitive. It was a difficult fight. He definitely frustrated Teofimo. So my point is that Loma comes back to win against contenders, top 5 top 10 level contenders at 135. And then comes the controversial matchup, which I have to point out the irony in this because I remember when people didn't like Lomachenko. I remember when the sentiment was against Vasiliy Lomachenko. However, he became a crowd favorite of sorts, especially by default, just because people disliked Devin Haney. I like Vasiliy Lomachenko, however, I also strive to be objective. I know everybody has repeated that the Haney fight was such a robbery. It was such an egregious robbery. And I will acknowledge that 116, 112 for Haney seems excessive. That's not a good scorecard to me. Personally, I saw it as a 7-5 either way type of fight. I've had people say, oh, well, you must be Bill Haney, or Bill Haney must have made this video. But what I noticed in particular about that fight is, first, I will say that Lomachenko put on an impressive performance. Definitely as an older champion, it was a throwback performance of sorts. With that said, the crowd was going crazy whenever Loma threw flurries, whether or not they landed or not. Even if they landed, even if they didn't land, whether they were all blocked, whether the shots missed, because of Loma's flashier activity, the crowd would go crazy whenever he would throw flurries. Whereas Haney was scoring with single shots that weren't as flashy, and the crowd was silent. So if you went by crowd noise, then yes, obviously Loma won the event. He won over the audience. However, it was a close fight, and the punch stats support that. And here's another aspect I want to point out with that fight. Whether it's a quiet round or an exciting round, it counts the same if there are no knockdowns or no point deductions. So if you want to say that Haney won 7 quiet rounds and Loma won 5 exciting rounds, it's still 7-5 for Haney. And again, I say that striving to be objective. I saw it as a 7-5 either way type of fight. Other people have looked to argue me down and say, oh, well, Loma won 7-5. If you're adamant that Loma won 7-5, then it shouldn't be beyond the realm of possibility that the judges or other people feel differently about 1 or 2 rounds, especially when there were tactical rounds, there were swing rounds, there were rounds that could have just gone the other way. There were quiet rounds. These things do actually happen. So I know I'll get some pushback for that. That is perfectly fine. I am not the all-knowing. That is just my 2 cents in regards to that fight. So moving on, we get to what would soon become Loma's career finale, which was an impressive win against George Kambosos, who actually fought Devin Haney and who actually defeated Teofimo Lopez. So ironically, there was no opportunity for Loma to get the Teofimo Lopez rematch because they became too far apart in weight. However, ironically enough, Loma did get a measure of indirect revenge in that he was able to score a stoppage over the guy who upset Teofimo Lopez. So all in all, to summarize, Loma went 13-3 in those fights. And the losses, the Salido loss had the underlying controversies with Salido not making weight. Obviously, there are many Haney haters and critics, so you have that fight that was certainly debatable. You could argue that Loma should have gotten the nod in that fight. And then the only clear loss, the only clear-cut loss where there was really no controversy would have been Teofimo Lopez. However, there's no shame in that. So I would say, all things considered, that Vasiliy Lomachenko is a first ballot Hall of Famer. I know he didn't have a huge number of fights, but his career is the epitome of quality over quantity. So that's my take on Vasiliy Lomachenko. Congratulations to him on an excellent career, and I hope to see him on the Hall of Fame ballot as soon as he is eligible.